So I think that covers it. Would you like to take some related questions from the audience?
Certainly, yeah.
All right. I'll pull them up. The first one is from a listener named Michael Slumzensky, and he asks, what do you think about recognizing one's own confirmation biases in order to have a more open mind and to be able to learn something that is contrary to what you now believe?
It is paramount. It is absolutely critical. This is kind of what we were talking about in some of the other videos, that confirmation bias is a framing error. It's a methodological error. It is the most sinister of all errors. This is true in the world of ideas, and it's certainly true in things like the martial arts or chess or anything that you're trying to learn. If you get into this insularity, you get into a group that everybody shares the same assumptions, and somebody either says, oh no, this move in the martial arts is better, it will beat your move, and you laugh and you say, oh, that's silly, you're just a crank, you don't know what you're talking about. Or it's something, obviously, you can take a million examples of in the world of ideas, you have this confirmation bias. It's like, oh, yeah, you're kind of a crank, and we can see, based on how we're looking at these topics, that our moves work. Like, look at all the people in Taekwondo that are kicking all the other people in Taekwondo. Obviously, Taekwondo works. It's like, well, no, you've made an essential framing error. It's absolutely critical to try to understand the abstract problems of what confirmation bias and framing errors are, and then to try to desperately make sure that you're not making those errors in whatever you're trying to learn.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to include that question because I see confirmation bias as really the opposite of, some of the gifts of failure that we've discussed here today. And there's something particularly insidious about confirmation bias in that it's like pretending to be on, a quest for knowledge while really being on a quest to just pull more factoids into like an intellectual safe space.
And here's what's even more devilish about it, though.
All right.
That can be conscious or unconscious.
Indeed.
There are some people that are self-aware that they're cherry picking, right? That they have confirmation bias. You can deal with that. That's an ego issue. Far more disastrous is when people are unaware of the confirmation bias and they sincerely believe that their methodology is accurate. Those are the sinister mistakes that will, wreck an entire worldview.
Absolutely. Well said. All right. The next question from Jessica Ralph. I've been taking a Udemy course on learning and speed reading, and half the course is all about improving your memory so you can actually remember the facts about things you've learned or read. I'd be interested to hear Steve's opinion on how important memory is for learning and if he has any advice on remembering what you've learned.
That's an excellent question. It depends on what you're trying to learn. So in something like history, for example, you have to have a memory. You have to understand facts and dates. I mean, that's an essential part of learning something like history. It's a little bit different with more theoretical things like in philosophy. So, for example, I have, read Descartes' arguments a few times, and I can probably loosely repeat them. But when did he write them? I don't know. What's the name of all of them? I'm not exactly sure. I couldn't tell you. I don't remember a lot of the facts surrounding them. I understand the theoretical ideas, because that's what I'm valuing as being important. But the actual factual stuff isn't as much there. And it's something that I certainly struggle with. I mean, my memory is not very good. I oftentimes am kind of off in my own world. Fortunately, I've been able to get away with it just because of the nature of philosophy, and the world in which I live is a very theoretical one. And so the concretes are not necessarily as important. In terms of techniques, though, there are a lot of really interesting techniques. I remember taking a speed reading course many years ago. So that was pretty awesome. And I still use some of the techniques just in terms of actual speed reading. But I remember one of the techniques they were talking about was mnemonics, where you manipulate language in such a way so that you can remember things more easily. Just Google it. That'd be one thing that I recommend. But also, you have to be very careful, in my own opinion, in going from factual recollection to rote learning.
Yeah.
This is a very you don't want to mistake understanding with being able to regurgitate facts and dates. Those are two very different things.
Absolutely, yeah. School plays that trick on us, especially in the realm of history. Like that's pretty much all it does. It's names and dates and places.
Right.
I guess it really comes down to, is something conceptual or procedural? Because I've seen people and I've interacted with people who seem like they have these steel trap minds for especially like concepts in philosophy. And I'm amazed by that. And for me, I really feel like it is just about capturing essences. It's good to actually interact with source material, because I find that is a better learning experience than just saying, read a summary. I remember Leonard Peikoff, and I included this in a show one time. He's like, never read Kant. He's like, just find summaries that other people have written and just read those.
That's very Randian, though.
Yeah,
he would also say never read Kant.
Yeah, well, he didn't say never interact with Kant on any level. Don't pretend Kant doesn't exist, but I don't recommend reading him unless you have to. And I find it's really, because my first interaction with philosophy was just like, some coffee table philosophy book. I guess I had a little bit of it when I was studying history, but just like, okay, well, here's the basics of, this set of ideas, German idealism. And then like in 2011, I did a big series on the history of Germany, and I really had to get into actually reading Hegel and Nietzsche and, heaven forbid, Kant and Fichte. And it was difficult after, just kind of skimming the surface of that. But I realized through that experience that all I'm ever going to be able to capture, because my hands are in so many different places, or I'm directing all this attention, is essences. That's all that I'm ever going to walk away from in those disciplines. But there are things that are procedural, where that rote memorization is more important.
That's
but
what you need.
The things that are procedural also have some kind of action involved with them, which is another kind of learning, right? So through doing and through repetition, it's easy to remember a procedure versus, everything that Kant wrote in the well, see, here I go. What's the critique of pure reason?
Yeah.
The critique of pure reason?
Pure reason. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. See, I remembered a title. There we go. and I have some of the essences of it as well. But so that distinction is really important. I think, is it conceptual or is it procedural? And that sets up different memory tasks for the learner.
And I want to add two things to that. One, I really agree with almost everything that you said. I would just say you have to be very wary of where you are getting your essences from. So a lot of times people will say, for example, Rand is a good example. Oh, Rand is just a fool. And she said she was essentially saying that like everybody is selfish and individualistic and they should like eat each other because she was a social atomist that, society is dumb. Like, well, where'd you get that? You get that this very second hand. If you want to actually grasp the essence of Rand, you probably should read Rand because there's so many inaccurate interpretations. This is the case with Kant. The question, there's a question, it's an open question in my mind. What did Kant mean? You have a lot of different interpretations, a lot of claims to capturing the essence of Kant, but when you actually try to sit down and read him, it's not necessarily so clear. So that's not, I don't disagree that you should also try to read other people's evaluations, but you have to have the principle of doubt in your mind that, well, maybe it's the case that everybody is misunderstanding what this person was trying to communicate.
Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that I think that Peikoff's argument was that you'll sink a bunch of time into this project, like reading the Critique of Pure Reason, and you'll walk away from it kind of disconnected from the time and that container of thought of German idealism, and you'll go, what the hell just happened?
That's true.
And I think that the people who came along after him, namely Fichte, which is the correct pronunciation I learned from a German.
I didn't know that. Thank you for saying that.
Yeah, Fichte. Somebody made a video once about how bad I was at pronouncing German. So it's on YouTube. I'll link it in the show notes. But Fichte and Hegel, which is how that is pronounced.
Okay, geez, I've been doing the hard H's.
Well, I think we can get away with Fichte and Hegel. I think they're acceptable, but yeah, this German listener was laughing and correcting me. They had interpretations of Kant that became the popular understandings of Kant, I think. Right. So that's interesting. But go ahead with what you were going to say.
So the other part of this is just kind of specific to philosophy, that you find this funny phenomena where I don't think people understand what clear philosophy looks like. Because so much philosophy is so dense and it's so poorly written, people think that is the nature of philosophy, is clunkily written. This is one of the reasons that I decided to go into philosophy and start writing philosophy, is because as far as I can tell, there's no reason for that. There's no, in fact, this is not just true in philosophy, this is true in any discipline. Things don't need to be clunky. Usually, not always, usually a clunky interpretation is reflective of a clunky understanding. And so you can't think if you read Kant, oh, this must be really good because that's really hard to understand. That's not necessarily true.
Right, indeed. Actually, this is interesting. I realized that my cameras had been set for a certain kind of light outside when we started. That light has completely changed. And now I'm looking at my monitor and I look like a ghost. So we're going to pause for a second. I'm using natural light today, which I'm experimenting with. And it was working at the beginning. Natural light changes regularly. It is not working anymore. I'm going to pull my curtain closed a little bit, and then we're going to return for one final question.
Okay.
Bear with me 1 second. All right. I just looked at my monitor and I saw like a pair of eyes and a mouth on what appeared to be like a dry erase board. And I'm like, oh, I'm a little washed out.
Yeah, no, natural light is very tough to work with.
Indeed.
Especially as you get closer into the evening, things start turning red and crazy.
Indeed. All right. Last question from Philip Figueiredo. Let me try that one more time. I had it right. I was practicing this one.
I don't think this is German, Brett.
No. I had this right. I was practicing before the show. Philip Figueiredo. Come on. One more try. Philip Figueiredo. I heard Steve mention The Art of Learning by Josh Waitzkin as a great resource. Mm-hmm. In Steve's opinion, what are the very first books, this actually kind of relates to our last conversation, to start with learning economics and philosophy so you get your thinking methodology correct from the start?
Excellent question. Okay. And I have to be very precise here because this is one of those foundational things that if you get wrong, you're going to have an inaccurate worldview. Here's what I would say. This is totally my own disposition on this, that I really like learning through the process of elimination. So I like learning why certain propositions are wrong first, and then I kind of develop my own worldview from there. An excellent book which illustrates this is called Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt. It's kind of it's the standard tome that everybody references. He's not correct on everything he says, but what he does is he goes through and he says, look, this is an economic concept as it is presented to you by schools or by the media, something like, oh, government should stimulate the economy in times of a recession. He takes that and then he breaks it down. He says, this is not the case and this is the reason. The same thing is true for actions of the central bank, and he goes through and he kind of takes the core ideas of Keynesian economics, which is still the underlying premises of which are still mainstream economics, and he dismantles them. I find that very helpful, but that I don't think he goes too much in detail about economic methodology. If you want to dive into economic methodology, which is, in my opinion, the most important part of specifically Austrian economics, is the methodology of economics, you have to read, unfortunately, Human Action, which is a really long book, and some people really like the writing, how it's written by an economist named Ludwig von Mises. Some people really like how he writes. Other people aren't necessarily as big fans. But he explains in some detail in the very beginning of the book, so maybe you just read the beginning of the book, economic reasoning, the process of economic reasoning. Now, there are other people that have also expanded on it. One is Murray Rothbard. He wrote a lot. He's a very well-known economist and political thinker. He wrote about the process of reasoning through economic propositions. And another one is Hans Hermann Hoppe, who I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of in a lot of ways, but he writes some interesting stuff about economic methodology. I think he's got a book that's called Economic Science and the Austrian Method, which is fairly short, and it will give you an introduction to the way to go about economic reasoning.
Okay, just a quick insert before we move on to that same question, I guess, in philosophy. Bob Murphy, who I'm sure you're familiar with, he wrote, and I'm wondering, was it Human Action or was it Man, Economy, and State? I'm actually going to look it up. He wrote basically a study guide that was pretty comprehensive for one, if not both of them. I'm certain it was Human Action, and it might be both, though I haven't read it, so I can't comment on it. I know Bob's a great writer, though. Okay, so that actually brings up a separate question that kind of relates to the whole Kant versus Rand discussion we had a few minutes ago. Mm-hmm. If you trust somebody's methodology, do you feel like they're and they prove to you, like the qualifying questions that we talked about in the last conversation, why should I be taking you seriously, teacher? If you feel like somebody proves to you that they should be taken seriously as a thinker, Wes, are you familiar with Wes Bertrand? Complete Liberty?
No.
Well, everybody, we've talked about Stefan Molyneux plenty. The people that I trusted in certain areas to explain things to me, do you accept those kinds of things as shortcuts? If you trust a person. Now, I've listened to Steph talk about certain things, and I've said, I think he's wrong about that. I don't agree with him there. Or even, Wes and I are friends, and we've had plenty of disagreements about a variety of topics. But there are places where I feel they are extremely trustworthy as thinkers and evaluators of other people's ideas. Do you think, and it kind of goes back to just the only really expecting to, in some cases, walk away with the essences of things? Is it okay to say, yes, I should read Man, Economy, and State, but I'm going to read Bob Murphy's summary instead? And how do you feel about that? I guess that's more of a subjective question, more than prescriptive.
This is of the utmost importance, and I treat this question with 100% severity because we're talking about kind of the basics of methodology.
Yeah.
The answer is it depends on what degree of understanding your goal is. If you actually want to feel 100% competent, that's your goal, is actual pure understanding. There is no substitute for diving into the ideas yourselves. You cannot take any idea, any proposition secondhand. You cannot. There is no room for that. That is incorporating methodological faith into your methodology, which is absolutely unacceptable if you want to have a complete understanding of something. It doesn't matter who the person is that's communicating to you. In fact, it doesn't even matter. Let's say you're trying to dive into Kant. It doesn't even matter if you perfectly understand what Kant was trying to say. The reason is this: Kant, the essence of Kant, or any thinker, may be actually imperfectly communicated by the person himself. So this is something, in fact, you see in Mises a little bit, is that worldview, that laissez-faire worldview that he's talking about, not just about economic methodology, but the laissez-faire worldview, he misses. He does not see the implications of his own beliefs. He was in favor of the draft of all things, which is crazy because he's this amazing laissez-faire economist, and he was in favor of the draft, and he was a libertarian. And he made a few of those errors, which are very grand. So you have to take the core concepts that you're learning in whatever it is, and you have to deal with them yourself. You have to phrase them in a way which is the most compelling way to you. It's not necessarily specifically what the person is communicating. It's you take their essence, what they're trying to communicate, and you make it a castle, and then you try to see if there are holes in the castle or errors in the way of thinking. That is, I don't see any way around that. I only see it as a very dangerous methodology to think that you can take the ideas secondhand. However, if your goal is not pure understanding, actual concrete mastery of something, then I don't see a way outside of taking these concepts in secondhand, because there's just too many ideas out there that are too poorly written. And Kant is an excellent example. Mm-hmm. Like, if you're going to try to really dive into the essence of Kant, unless you have a ton of time, but you don't want to, your goal is not to master Kant, it's to understand the essence of what he was saying, just kind of in the basics. Then yes, you have to survey the literature, the secondhand literature that is written about the man. I mean, there's just not enough time, in our lifetimes, if you want to have any kind of broad worldview, to be able to really deeply understand these things without interpreting them secondhand, which is scary, and it also relates to what we're talking about, this principle of humility, you might call it, because it's very possible, I'm sure a ton of people would have this experience, their conception of the elementary nature of Rand's worldview would be shattered if they actually read Rand, right? A lot of people, especially on the left, have very strong and dismissive ideas about objectivism and objectivist philosophy, and the strength of their conclusions would be utterly destroyed if they actually cracked open a book and dove into it. So the healthy mindset is, I have to be open. If I'm not willing to dive into these ideas 100%, I have to be willing to admit my conception was wrong, I made some elementary error, and I have to adjust. So you must have that kind of humility if you're not going 100%.
Yeah, last month on the show, we talked about productivity. And one of the most important aspects of that conversation, and this month has been a follow-up to that, right? Like, get a foundation for executing in life. This month is, learn and execute to your full potential. And then next month, we're actually going on to conversations and creativity, execute in ways that are exciting and effective, basically. And one of the most important aspects of the productivity month was clarifying a purpose for oneself, and that's a huge part of it, because you're right. I mean, there is way too much out there to really be able to interface with it in a very, very thorough way. So you seem like you found a purpose, in what you want to do, how you want to communicate, the ideas that you want to present, and that allows you some focus. Yes. Right? There's things that can pass. I mean, and it's frustrating for me too, because there's so many things passing me by that I would love to comment on, and I just don't have time, because it's not part of my mission, And maybe if I had a bigger team of people, I could do that. But for now, that's the way it is, and I have to accept that. So I think having some kind of clarity there allows you to better focus in on where you're actually going to spend your time. And then I agree with what you're saying about really making learning an active process by dealing directly with the primary sources,
Yes.
And having conversations with yourself while you do it. One of the best learning experiences for me was when I was a teacher, but off from teaching during the summers. I would paint houses, and I had an iPod, and I would work on jobs like alone. I'd be the only one at a house. Even the people who lived there weren't home. So this was a great time where I'd be listening to Rothbard. Rothbard was new to me at the time, and I would pause it, and I would just talk to myself, about what he was saying. I would try to rephrase it in my own words.
Yes.
Same thing with other books that followed from there. And that was a really, really useful exercise. It made it a very, very active process. When you're going to somebody like, hey, I love Bob Murphy, and I can't wait to hear what he has to say about man, economy, and state. Yeah, that's fun, and I'm sure Bob's a great writer. He's a very entertaining guy. But it's not as active a process as, listening or reading, pausing, and actually deliberating with yourself.
Yes, and you said a little phrase there that is also of the utmost importance, and I just wrote about this last Sunday on my blog. You said you have to put things in your own words. Now, That is something which is inescapable. It is absolutely essential to actually have a accurate conceptual understanding of something. Has to be in your own conceptual worldview. Other people's words do not speak for you, and they use words in different ways than you do, and you have to put them in your own terminology. And here's the key. Because that phenomena is always taking place, there is always taking your the inputs and putting them into your own conceptual framework. When you're reading Bob Murphy's writing about human action, you're reading through his lens, which is then going through your lens. So you have this secondary lens. That process of putting things into your own words is something that authors are consciously or subconsciously doing about their source material. So that makes it one more chain down the reasoning process. If you're trying to grasp a concept, you are now getting it through two filters instead of one.
So that's economics. What about philosophy?
So I would have two recommendations for philosophy. One is the upcoming book that is called Square One, The Foundations of Knowledge. It is about the methodology of epistemology, about the methodology of thinking. It's about logic. The reason I wrote it is to answer that question. Where do you start? You start right here, and it'll be out in the next couple of months.
Awesome.
The other, what I would say is it's not necessarily a book. It is what I think I mentioned before on this show was a website called closertotruth.org. If you're interested in philosophy, this is an essential resource. It's not necessarily about like logic and epistemology. It's a guy that goes around and asks a bunch of experts all across the globe a bunch of really interesting questions about the nature of consciousness, of God, philosophy, lots of different questions in philosophy. What's the nature of numbers? There's all kinds of questions that he engages in. And what you'll see is the methodology of skepticism, that he goes into his interviews from a devil's advocate standpoint. Says, well, okay, tell me why I'm wrong. If I were to say this, why is this idea wrong? And he'll go and he'll talk to the empiricist, he'll talk to the rationalist, he'll talk to the physicalist, and he'll talk to the dualist. That methodology of approaching things skeptically, I think, is essential for understanding philosophy. And what you'll also find is the reason, the justification for the skeptical methodology, the skeptical approach, is because in all of these different claims, all of these different worldview claims, there are weaknesses that you will discover. And that is just such an excellent resource to see the case for skepticism in philosophy.
Absolutely. Well said. So we covered a lot today. We went in a lot of different directions, all great stuff. For the people in my audience, what would you say is the most essential takeaway of this fifth principle, embracing one's incompetence?
The essential nature of this principle is to understand failure as feedback. Failure is feedback. And if you can emotionally overcome the obstacles that your ego puts in the way of understanding things and learning things, and understand failure as feedback, your process of learning will be exponential. It won't be linear.
Excellent. I'm glad we disciplined ourselves a little bit. I feel like this show could have been 4 hours, talking about this topic. And I want to, now that we've concluded, I really want to thank you for taking all of this time and sharing all of this wisdom with us. This has been a really educational month for me, as I anticipated it would be. And I really hope that, positive feedback continues to come your way from my audience. I hope there's a conversation that can begin there. And I hope a lot of these people who've been listening to School Sucks will be watching you on YouTube and reading your writing. And I wanted to make sure that they knew where to go to get those things before we finally wrap up here today.
Thanks, Brett. I appreciate the opportunity. This is something that initial video which sparked your interest, the 5 Principles of Learning, or whatever it was called, this is information that I have not shared before in such a public format. It's something I've just been holding on to for many years. So I'm just super duper excited to be able to share it with you, who's obviously interested and your audience is interested in it. So this has been great for me. And if people want to learn more about my writing, learn more about the worldview I'm trying to create and basics, which I try to focus on in terms of philosophy, steve-patterson.com, and that'll have links to my Twitter and Facebook and YouTube site and all of that. And I'd love to engage with your audience too. If they have questions about anything I've said, you think I'm totally full of it about consciousness or the nature of numbers or quantum physics, shoot me an email and we'll talk about it.
Awesome. And I think there's lots of really rich opportunities for future discussions, not just with me, but with people in the audience through like a Google Hangout or a call in or even just in the group. So I really look forward to that. And I hope you'll come back on the show in the future and we can explore other ideas together.
Certainly. Thanks, Brett.
My pleasure.